The fluorescent lights hum their endless drone above the ICU at St. Michael's, Denver, a sound so constant it becomes invisible after 8 months. Brooke Sullivan doesn't hear it anymore. She hears everything else: the ventilator's rhythmic wheeze, the cardiac monitor's steady beep, the soft squeak of her shoes on polished tile as she moves between beds, checking lines, adjusting drips, reading the vital signs that tell stories most people never learn to hear. Her hands move with the kind of precision that comes from repetition so thorough it becomes muscle memory. The kind that doesn't forget. She's setting up an arterial line on the post-op admission in bed for routine gallbladder removal, routine recovery, when Dr. Pierce walks the morning rounds. She doesn't look up. She never does. The 18-gauge catheter slides into the radial artery with that specific resistance that means it's placed correctly. The fluid column rises in the clear tubing. 68. Stable. She tapes it down with the kind of care that suggests she understands this is someone's lifeline, not just another procedure to complete before the shift ends. The patient, a retired accountant, Mr. Chen, 72 years old, says thank you. Most don't notice her anymore. 8 months at St. Michael's has made her invisible, which is exactly what she intended. The scrubs are always slightly wrinkled. The badge lanyard is always worn at an angle. The dark hair is always pulled back in a way that says efficiency, not confidence. The scar running from her left collarbone down beneath the neckline of her scrubs, old, pale, precise, is the kind of thing people see but never ask about. Dr. Pierce is talking about sepsis protocols to the third-year residents trailing behind him like ducklings. His voice carries the particular tone of someone who has never been questioned, never will be, and finds the prospect amusing rather than threatening. Chief of Surgery at St. Michael's for 14 years. Board certified. Published. Photographed at hospital fundraisers holding champagne in one hand and the elbow of some administrator in the other. He's the kind of handsome that comes from money and good dentistry and the absolute certainty that the world will rearrange itself according to his preference. He's rounding past bed for when the nurse from orthopedics escorts a Navy officer through the ICU, some kind of official visit, some kind of inspection that doesn't officially exist but everyone knows about anyway. Dress uniform. Ribbons. The kind of bearing that suggests the person wearing it has made decisions that cost lives. Brooke is checking medication orders on the computer. She doesn't turn around. She doesn't need to. But her spine straightens exactly half an inch. Her shoulders reset. Her chin lifts the way it does when she's listening to commands instead of just suggestions. It's the kind of thing that takes half a second and means absolutely nothing to anyone who hasn't spent time around people whose entire life is conducted in posture and precision. Dr. Pierce's eyes narrow. He pauses mid-sentence about empiric antibiotics and looks at Brooke, really looks at her, for the first time since she started at St. Michael's. She's still focused on the monitor. She doesn't know he's watching. But something shifts in the room's air pressure. Something recognizes something else. After rounds, he finds the excuse easily. Quality assurance. Credentialing verification. He requests her personnel file from HR and it arrives on his desk by noon. The usual things: nursing degree from Colorado State, 3 years of community hospital experience in Fort Collins, clean license, one minor documentation discrepancy from 6 years ago that went nowhere. The kind of file that suggests someone competent but unremarkable. Promotable but not ambitious. The kind of person who shows up, does the work, doesn't make trouble. But he's looking for something else now. He's looking for the thing that made her spine straighten at the sight of a uniform. He's looking for the contradiction. And he finds it during his afternoon visit to the locker room when Brooke is changing out of her ICU scrubs before the evening shift. She's removing her jacket. The one she wears every day, regulation hospital issue, grey with a faded logo on the back. And there, sewn with careful stitches along the interior lining, just above where her ribs would be, is a patch. Faded. Worn. A unit designation. 2nd Medical Battalion. The letters are barely visible but they're there, threaded into the fabric like a secret heartbeat, like something she's carried against her skin for so long it's become part of her biology. Dr. Pierce is standing in the doorway and she freezes for exactly 0.2 of a second, not the freeze of fear, but the freeze of recognition, the freeze of someone who just realized a door they thought was closed has been opened. She meets his eyes without flinching, without blinking, without the slightest tremor in her composure. "Laundry day," he says. His voice is pleasant, conversational. The kind of pleasant that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up if you know what to listen for. "Jacket's broken in," she says. Her voice is flat, neutral. The kind of neutral that says, "I don't owe you an explanation." She folds the jacket carefully and places it in her locker, hiding the patch from view but not from his knowledge. He now knows what she was. Now knows why she moves the way she moves, why her hands don't shake under pressure, why her eyes see things in charts that other nurses miss. Now knows she's dangerous in a way he needs to eliminate. "Long time between postings," he says. He's still in the doorway. She's still in front of her locker. Must be nice to be back stateside. Quieter work. She doesn't answer. She reaches for her fresh scrubs and turns to face him, and there's something in that turn, something in the way she positions herself, in the angle of her shoulders, in the fact that she's no longer between him and the exit, that suggests she's done something very similar before. Assessed threats. Calculated angles. Made decisions about how much space she needed to protect herself if this conversation went in a direction that required more than words. "I prefer the ICU," she says. "More control. Better outcomes when you pay attention to details." There's nothing threatening in the sentence. There's nothing insubordinate about it. But there's an implication underneath it, like the dark side of the ocean, the suggestion that she's not impressed with his title, not intimidated by his position, not the kind of person who becomes invisible because she lacks capacity. She becomes invisible because she chooses to. And now he knows that, too, which is exactly the problem. That night, Admiral James Kearney is admitted to her unit. Post-operative day 1. Routine gallbladder removal. Routine vitals. Routine recovery. The kind of admission that happens 100 times a month at St. Michael's and doesn't mean anything except another chart to manage, another set of lines to monitor, another night of checking vitals every 2 hours. Brooke receives the admission sheet from the ER nurses and her hands pause for exactly 1 heartbeat when she reads the name. Admiral James Kearney. Navy medic. 3rd tour rotation. And beneath that, in the clinical summary, the notation about his service record, the kind of service record that carries weight, that carries decisions, that carries the kind of classified background that doesn't appear in civilian hospital files except when someone with clearance manually inputs it. She touched the patch inside her jacket without thinking. A gesture so small, so automatic, that no one else in the unit would notice. But the memory is there, hot and bright and 14 years away, a dust-covered compound in Baghdad, a medical tent where the fluorescent lights were powered by generators that sounded like diesel engines joking. Where the same Captain Brooke Sullivan, then Major, still in service, still in uniform, had trained a younger Navy medic named James Kearney on how to manage a sucking chest wound with a needle decompression, on how to stay calm when everything around you is falling apart, on how to remember that the person in front of you is someone's son, someone's brother, someone worth saving even if the cost is your own peace of mind. She'd been extracted 3 weeks after his rotation began. Some black operation that didn't make the official record. Some decision made by people whose rank was so high it existed only in classified files. One day she was there. The next day she was gone, and everyone who remained was told that Captain Brooke Sullivan never existed, that her records were sealed, that her service was erased into the kind of classified silence that usually means someone did something that saved a lot of lives but couldn't be discussed at state dinners. She'd taken the patch from her field jacket, the one she buried in a duffel bag that went to a P.O. box in Colorado, and sewn it into the lining of a civilian jacket, because even classified people need some evidence that they were real. And now Admiral Kearney is in bed 3, post-op day 1, and Dr. Pierce knows she's not just a quiet nurse. He knows she's someone with a history. Someone with clearances. Someone with the kind of connections that don't appear on any organizational chart. Which means he needs to neutralize her before she becomes a problem. Before she notices the invoice discrepancies. Before she realizes that the phantom consultations on military patients are being billed to the VA and that someone with access to classified files and the authority to check them, might eventually ask questions. She doesn't know yet what Dr. Pierce is planning. She doesn't know that by tomorrow morning he'll be making phone calls to people who owe him favors. She doesn't know that her containment has already begun, quiet and methodical, the way a surgeon approaches the removal of something dangerous. She just knows that she's in the same room with two ghosts from her past, and the most dangerous one isn't the Admiral. The most dangerous one is the chief of surgery, who just realized that the invisible nurse in the ICU is someone who could dismantle everything he's built if she ever starts paying attention to the right details. And that's exactly what's about to happen. Thursday morning, 8:38 a.m., St. Michael's conference room. 30 staff members packed shoulder to shoulder as Dr. Pierce dimmed the lights and pulled up patient files on the projection screen. Brooke stood at the back wall, her hands folded in front of her, watching the cursor move across the digital presentation. She'd been at St. Michael's 8 months. Long enough to recognize the setup. Long enough to know what was coming. Dr. Pierce's laser pointer flickered to life, a thin red beam cutting through the fluorescent glow. "This," he announced, circling one of Brooke's assessment notes, "is what happens when nurses forget their lane." His voice carried the weight of institutional authority, the tone of a man who'd built his career on the assumption that he was the only competent person in any room. Notice the diagnostic speculation here. The treatment suggestions. The patient advocacy language that borders on insubordination. The red circle expanded across her handwriting, recommend cardiac echo per post-op protocol. "Little Miss Battlefield here," Pierce continued, his smile never wavering, "thinks 8 months on a medical surgical floor makes her a physician." He tapped the laser pointer against the screen for emphasis. Each tap was deliberate. Designed to land. These are the kinds of documentation errors that create liability exposure. Legal vulnerability. They suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of scope of practice. The residents laughed. Not genuine laughter. The kind that came from witnessing a superior officer perform a necessary humiliation ritual, and understanding that their job security depended on endorsing it. Brooke felt the heat rise in her chest, not in her face, never in her face. 8 months of practice had taught her how to compartmentalize it, how to let the anger settle into her core where it wouldn't show. She took one measured breath, pulled in through her nose, let it out through her mouth. She was still standing. Still breathing. Still there. Then her eyes burned. Just once. A single tear escaped, falling before she could stop it. She wiped it away quickly, before anyone turned to see where it had come from. The gesture was small enough that only someone trained to read body language would have noticed, and there were no combat veterans in this room to see it. Just Pierce, performing his dominance ritual. Just 30 staff members learning the hierarchy. Just Brooke learning the cost of invisibility. The presentation continued for another 43 minutes. 6 more of her notes circled in red. 3 more jokes at her expense. By the time Pierce closed the laptop and the residents filed out, talking quietly about their weekend plans, Brooke's jaw was tight enough to crack teeth. She didn't cry again. Not there. Not where anyone could see. 2 hours later, the third-floor vending machine hummed its monotonous electric song. Brooke had 30 seconds before her next patient check. She needed water. She needed 30 seconds of being alone with her thoughts. Admiral Keeney was moving slowly down the corridor in his hospital-issued robe, his incision tender enough that every step required conscious effort. He'd been making the walk 3 times a day, down to the nurse's station and back, building strength, following protocol. His shoulders remained squared despite the pain. Even injured, even in a bathrobe, he moved like someone who'd spent his life under orders, executing them with precision. Brooke had been inserting coins into the machine when she heard his footsteps. Her body responded before her mind could catch up. Her spine stiffened. Her shoulders rolled back. Every muscle memory from 13 years of service contracted at once, pulling her into the posture of someone who stood at attention. It was invisible to the untrained eye, just a shift in carriage, a change in how she held her weight, but it was unmistakable to anyone who'd ever served. Dr. Pierce turned the corner at exactly that moment, for residents trailing behind him like satellites orbiting a sun. His face changed. A flicker of recognition crossed his eyes, quick and sharp as a blade. He saw the straightening. He saw the automatic military bearing. He saw something he could use. "Look at that!" Pierce's voice cracked like a whip through the hallway. "Playing soldier again, Sullivan? What's next, saluting the vending machine? Should we get you a little uniform and a matching insignia?" He gestured toward Admiral Kearney, whose pace had slowed slightly at the sound of the commotion. "Maybe you and the Admiral can do some synchronized marching drills. Really commit to the fantasy." The residents laughed. Louder this time. More confident. Pierce had just signaled that this target was safe. That this woman could be mocked without consequences. That her military bearing, whatever its source, was something to be ridiculed in broad daylight. Brooke met his eyes. The anger wasn't in her face. It never was. But it was in the stillness of her posture, in the way her jaw relaxed instead of tightening, in the complete absence of defensiveness. "I don't play at anything, Doctor," she said quietly. Her voice had dropped an octave. The tone had shifted from deferential nurse to something else entirely, something measured and controlled and absolutely certain. "Not in Baghdad. Not here." The silence that followed lasted exactly 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, Pierce's expression flickered through confusion, then anger, then something that looked almost like fear. Admiral Kearney had stopped walking. One of the residents took half a step backward. Then Brooke turned away from the vending machine without her water and walked past all of them toward the ICU. Her steps were even. Her shoulders stayed back. Every inch of her body language had transformed. Pierce stood frozen in the hallway, his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. That afternoon, the humidity in the ICU felt like breathing through wet gauze. The ventilators wheezed their mechanical rhythm. The heart monitors beeped in their steady electronic pulse, a sound that had become as familiar to Brooke as her own heartbeat, though infinitely more reliable. Admiral Kearney was resting, his incision healing cleanly, his vitals stable. Brooke was checking his dressing, the gauze still clean, the surgical site showing no signs of infection, the edges beginning their microscopic work of knitting back together, when Dr. Pierce appeared beside her. Not approaching from the front. Appearing from the side, close enough that she could smell his coffee breath and the expensive cologne he wore like armor. "Your attitude is becoming a problem," he said quietly, his voice low enough that only she could hear it over the ambient noise of the unit. His jaw was tight. His hands were fists at his sides. "I can have security escort you out today. You understand that? One phone call and you're gone. Escorted from the building. No severance, no reference." Brooke finished checking the dressing before responding. She didn't rush. She didn't fumble. Her hand stayed steady, her breathing even, her entire being compressed into the simple act of caring for her patient. "You're not cut out for real medicine, Sullivan," Pierce continued, his voice dropping even lower. "This isn't some MASH tent. This isn't Baghdad. This is a civilian hospital where we follow proper protocols and respect the chain of command. You're a nurse. Not a medic. Not a soldier. Not whatever fantasy you've been living out in that head of yours." Brooke finished securing the dressing. She straightened. She turned to face him, and when she met his eyes, there was no anger in her expression, only absolute clarity. "I've held more intestines in my hands than you've seen in textbooks, Doctor." The words landed like a physical blow. Pierce's face darkened. His hands opened and closed. He'd come prepared for tears or defensiveness or the kind of emotional reaction that would validate his assessment of her competence. He hadn't come prepared for this, a woman who stood absolutely still, who spoke in a voice like ice water, who looked at him the way a sniper looks down a scope. "You need to understand what's at stake here," he began, but Brooke was already moving past him, back to Admiral Kearney's bedside, back to the work of monitoring vitals and checking surgical sites and doing the 1,000 small things that kept her patients alive. Pierce stood in the middle of the ICU for another 4 seconds, then pulled his phone from his pocket and stepped into the corridor. By 1:38 p.m., he'd made 4 phone calls. By 2:16 p.m., he'd contacted 2 hospital board members and suggested that Brooks' military background might indicate psychological instability. By 3:15 p.m., he'd reached out to a colleague in HR with concerns about hostile workplace behavior and insubordination patterns. He was very good at this part. The strategic part. The part where competence actually mattered. He understood institutional power the way a musician understands an instrument. Every call was calculated. Every allegation was constructed to maximize damage while remaining technically defensible. He wasn't yelling now. He wasn't emotional. This was clinical. This was the work of a man who'd spent his career learning how to destroy people quietly, how to use the system itself as a weapon. Brooke had no idea any of this was happening. She was back in the ICU with Admiral Kearney, checking his O2 saturation, monitoring his post-op recovery, doing the work that mattered. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 2:13 p.m. sharp, when Admiral Kearney's breathing changed. The Admiral had been resting peacefully, his oxygen saturation steady at 98%, his heart rate normal for someone 2 days post-op. Brooke was in his room checking his surgical dressing when she heard it, the shift in his respirations. Not the measured breathing of sleep. The rapid, shallow breathing of someone whose lungs were being crushed by pressure. She looked up. His neck veins were distending. His trachea was deviating right. His skin was turning from pink to gray as his oxygen saturation dropped like a stone. 94, 89, 84. Tension pneumothorax, she said aloud, though there was no one there to hear her. But her hands were already moving, already calling for the crash cart, already hitting the code button that would summon the surgical team. The intercom crackled to life, her voice calm and clear and absolutely certain. Surgical emergency, ICU bed 7. Tension pneumothorax. Need immediate chest decompression. Now. 30 seconds. That's all it took for her world to collapse into a single moment of crystalline focus. The Admiral's oxygen monitor dropping. His lips turning blue. His hand reaching for her arm as panic tried to claw its way up his throat. And one word, whispered desperate and urgent, Fallujah. That one word meant everything. That one word meant she wasn't a nurse checking vitals anymore. She was something else. Something older. Something that had been sleeping for 8 months under wrinkled scrabs and quiet dignity. Admiral Kearney's breathing changed at 2:07 p.m. Brooke noticed it first, the way his chest rose too fast, too shallow, like a bird trapped in a cage. His oxygen saturation had been stable at 97% just moments before. Now the monitor showed 91. Then 87. The numbers falling like dropped stones. His neck veins bulged against his skin, distended and pulsing with pressure that shouldn't have been there. His lips were losing color, fading from pink to a gray that made Brooke's entire body go absolutely still. Tension pneumothorax. His lung had collapsed. Air was trapped between his lung and his chest wall, crushing his heart, compressing the vessels that kept him alive. In Baghdad she had seen this exact presentation 3 times in field conditions. Twice the patient made it to the surgical hospital. Once they didn't. The 3rd time had been on her, and Captain Brooke Sullivan had made the call that saved a Marine's life with nothing but a needle and a prayer whispered in a language she'd learned to forget. She moved to the bedside. Not rushed. Not panicked. Muscle memory didn't panic. Muscle memory simply knew. The oxygen saturation was 84 now. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor of someone whose heart was working against impossible pressure. Code blue, she said into the overhead page. ICU. Decompression needed. 20 seconds. The response was immediate. Footsteps. The sound of chairs pushing back from desks, the clatter of equipment being abandoned mid-task. The surgical team mobilized like they'd trained for this exact scenario 1,000 times. 20 doctors on shift that afternoon. All of them answered the page. All of them came. Dr. Pierce arrived first. He moved through the doorway with his shoulders back, his expression already calculating, already building the narrative he would need if something went wrong. Behind him came the residents, the fellows, the attending surgeons who'd spent their careers keeping their heads down and their malpractice insurance paid. They filled the ICU like a wave. 20 faces. 20 pairs of eyes. 20 professionals who understood exactly what was happening. Tension pneumo, Brooke said, her voice level. O2 sat 84 and dropping. Tracheal deviation. We need decompression between the second and third rib, midclavicular line. Now. The room went absolutely silent. Not the silence of focus. The silence of calculation. The silence of people weighing risk against consequence. The Admiral's oxygen saturation hit 82. Then 79. His lips were the color of concrete. His eyes were starting to unfocus, the look of someone whose brain wasn't getting enough oxygen to maintain consciousness. This is the Admiral's case, Dr. Pierce said. His voice was quiet. Controlled. The voice of a man who had already made his decision and was simply narrating it for the record. This is the controversial admission. And this is exactly why we have protocols about liability. One of the junior residents moved forward. His name was Dr. Matheson, 28 years old, still new enough to think medicine was about saving lives instead of managing risk. His hand reached toward the supply cart. He was going to help. He was going to do what doctors were trained to do. Dr. Pierce caught his arm. Not roughly. Just firmly. A message delivered through touch instead of words. This is Sullivan's assessment. Let her take the liability. The room held its breath. 20 doctors. 20 sets of shoulders that could move. 20 pairs of hands that had been trained in emergency medicine. They looked at each other. They looked at the Admiral. They looked at the door. The oxygen saturation hit 76. His heart rate climbed past 140. The monitor beeped its urgent rhythm like a countdown to something nobody wanted to watch. I need help, Brooke said. Her voice hadn't changed. Still level. Still calm. The voice of someone asking for assistance, not begging for it. This patient needs decompression. Who's with me? Nobody moved. The attending surgeon looked at his shoes. The residents looked at Pierce. Pierce looked at the Admiral with the expression of a man calculating how this story would be told afterward, how the liability would flow, who would take the blame when the paperwork was filed. Brooke saw the moment each doctor made their decision. She saw the exact second when self-preservation won. First one resident turned and walked toward the door. Then another. Then the attending surgeon who'd been on shift for 16 hours. Then the fellows. They left one by one, filing out of the ICU like pallbearers, leaving behind a man whose oxygen saturation was now 72 and whose heart was running out of time. 17 gone. 18. 19. The room emptied until only Dr. Pierce remained, standing near the doorway, his expression unreadable. You touch him and you're done here, he said. Suspended pending investigation. Your license. Your career. Everything you've built in 8 months. The Admiral's lips were nearly blue now. His eyes were closing. His body was shutting down in real time, the autonomic nervous system deciding that consciousness was a luxury it could no longer afford. Brooke felt something shift inside her chest. Not fear. Not doubt. The feeling was older than fear. Older than hesitation. It was the feeling of Captain Brooke Sullivan waking up from a dream she'd been having for 8 months, the feeling of the woman who'd held a dying Marine's intestines in her hands and kept him alive through sheer force of will and training and refusal to accept that failure was an option. The patch was still there, sewn inside her jacket lining. She could feel it against her ribs. Faded. Worn. The only proof she'd ever been anything other than a quiet nurse who accepted insults and nodded when doctors spoke. She could smell the ICU, antiseptic and saline, and the particular copper scent of someone's blood pressure dropping into the danger zone. She could hear the monitor beeping its urgent rhythm. She could hear the ventilator wheeze. She could hear her own breathing, steady and measured and absolutely controlled. She picked up the 14-gauge needle from the crash cart. The metal was cool in her palm. She'd held this same instrument before, in conditions far worse than a sterile hospital with fluorescent lights and backup equipment. She'd held it in a field hospital where the only anesthesia was pressure and prayer and the absolute certainty that the alternative was death. "Don't you dare," Dr. Pierce said. His voice had changed. Now it carried an edge, the sound of a man watching his narrative fall apart in real time. "You're suspended if you touch him. Terminated. I'll have your license pulled. I'll contact the state board. I'll contact every hospital in Colorado. You will never work in medicine again." Brooke found the second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. Muscle memory and training, moving her hands with the precision of someone who'd done this under fire, under pressure, with nothing but certainty to guide her. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She was absolutely steady. "Then I guess I'm fired, doctor." She didn't wait for permission she knew wouldn't come. She didn't look at the 20 doctors who'd chosen their careers over a life, who'd walked out of the ICU and left her standing alone with a man whose body was shutting down second by second. She thought about the woman she used to be, the captain who didn't exist in any database, the operative who'd been ordered to vanish after a Black Ops extraction that officially never happened. That woman was still here. She'd never left. She'd been waiting. Brooke pushed the needle between the Admiral's ribs. The resistance of muscle tissue. The slight give as the needle penetrated the pleural space. And then the sound, a distinctive hiss of air escaping, the sound of pressure releasing, the sound of a lung re-expanding after being crushed by the weight of its own failure. The Admiral's oxygen saturation climbed. 75, 82. 88, the monitor's rhythm shifted. His blood pressure stabilized. His body had a chance again. The room was completely silent except for the sound of that escaping air and the Admiral's chest beginning to rise and fall with something approaching normal rhythm. Brooke kept her hand on the needle, feeling the last of the air escape, feeling the physics of the body correcting itself now that the pressure had been relieved. She didn't look at Dr. Pierce. She didn't acknowledge the doctors who'd filed out. She simply kept her hand steady and waited for the body to remember how to breathe. 20 doctors had walked out. 20 professionals had chosen liability over duty. 20 people had decided that their careers were more important than the life of an admiral of the United States Navy. But there had been one person left. One nurse. One captain who'd stopped hiding. And that single decision was about to change everything. The needle went in clean. Between the second and third rib, midclavicular line, exactly where muscle memory had trained her hands 10 years ago in a trauma tent that officially never existed. The plastic catheter slid through skin and fascia and pleural membrane with the kind of fluid precision that comes from having done this when the alternative was watching someone die in the sand. Admiral Kieni's chest was a study in collapse. His trachea was deviating. His oxygen sat was 62 and falling like a stone. 20 doctors had walked out of this ICU rather than touch him, their footsteps echoing down the corridor one by one, each one following Dr. Pierce's pointed glare and whispered warnings about liability and controversy and career risk. 20 brilliant physicians choosing their pension over a patient's life. Brooke didn't count them as they left. She was already moving. The needle punctured through. There was the distinctive pop as the trapped air released under pressure, sudden, audible, the sound of pressure equalizing like a breath finally taken after drowning. The hiss was unmistakable in the silence. It was the sound she remembered from Fallujah, from a corpsman's tent, from hands that belonged to someone else now but still remembered everything. Admiral Kieni gasped. His body convulsed once, then settled. Color rushed back into his face like someone had turned a valve. His lips went from dusky blue to pale pink to something approximating human. The oxygen monitor climbed, 72, 78, 85, 91. Each number was a heartbeat of her own making. Each number was redemption. Brooke called for the chest tube setup without looking up. Her voice was steady. It was the voice of someone who had given orders in a language bullets understood. It was the voice that lived underneath the scrubs and the apologies and the years of making herself small. The code team moved. Not because she was a nurse asking politely. Because something in her tone suggested that hesitation wasn't an option. Dr. Pierce appeared in the doorway. His face was the color of old bone. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it, opened it again like a fish trying to breathe air. "You're done," he said finally. His voice had the texture of gravel. "Security. Now." Brooke didn't acknowledge him. She stayed until the attending placed the chest tube properly, until she'd confirmed the placement with a chest X-ray that showed the line in perfect position, until Admiral Kieni's breathing stabilized at 96% saturation and his heart rate climbed back toward something resembling normal. She stayed until he was stable. Until someone else could take over. Only then did she step back. 2 security guards waited outside the ICU. They wore the polite, apologetic expressions of men who didn't want to be there but had been given orders. Dr. Pierce was already on his phone in the hallway, his back to her, his free hand gesturing frantically as he talked. She heard fragments as she passed: board members, unstable employee, credential verification. I have 4 contacts who can confirm she's fabricating. By 6:11 p.m., Brooke was in the HR office on the 3rd floor. A woman named Margaret with kind eyes and no authority sat across from her with a folder that had gotten very thick very fast. Dr. Pierce had called board members who owed him favors. He had contacted her references, the ones he'd had fabricated, to plant doubt. He had somehow triggered an external investigator to audit her credentials before the sun went down. The process felt like watching a building collapse in slow motion. You could see each brick falling, but you couldn't stop it. By 8:51 p.m., she was suspended pending investigation. By midnight, Brooke sat alone in an all-night diner on Colfax Avenue in Denver, the kind of place that served watered-down coffee to insomniacs and ghosts. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry wasps. The vinyl booth was cracked and held the memory of 1,000 tired conversations. She was the only customer. The waitress had stopped asking if she needed anything an hour ago. Her coffee was cold in the white ceramic cup. The window reflected her face back at her, tired, hollow, barely recognizable as the woman who had walked into St. Michael's that morning. Just a nurse. That's what Dr. Pierce had called her. Just a nurse playing at things she didn't understand. Just a nurse with delusions of competence. She had just saved an admiral's life with her hands. She had just lost everything with her hands. The jacket hanging on the hook beside her had the faded unit patch sewn inside the lining. 2nd Medical Battalion. The only proof she'd ever worn a uniform. The only thing she'd kept from Captain Brooke Sullivan. Nobody at the diner could see it. Nobody would ever know what it meant. Her phone was off. She'd turned it off in the HR office and hadn't turned it back on. Nobody was coming. Nobody knew where she was except the waitress, and the waitress was only here because she was scheduled until 6 a.m. Brooke stared at her reflection in the dark window and wondered if disappearing forever 10 years ago might have been easier than this. At least then, she'd had an order. At least then, she'd known she was supposed to vanish. Now she was disappearing on her own, by accident, 1 suspension letter at a time. The waitress refilled her coffee without asking. The pot was still hot, at least. 48 hours passed like water through fingers. Brooke didn't leave the apartment. She didn't shower. She sat on the edge of her bed and stared at the wall and let time do what time does, move forward indifferent to whether you wanted it to or not. The hospital had suspended her pending investigation. The investigation would take weeks. By then, Dr. Pierce would have made sure her reputation was so thoroughly destroyed that even if she was cleared, no hospital in Colorado would hire her. He was competent, at least. She had to give him that. He wasn't just louder bullying. He was a strategist who understood how institutions worked, how favors flowed, how a single whisper in the right ear could become a narrative that everyone believed. On the morning of day 3, her phone rang. She'd turned it back on that morning out of habit, the same way she'd made coffee she didn't drink and brushed her teeth she didn't care about brushing. The number on the screen wasn't one she recognized. Area code 703. Northern Virginia. She answered. Captain Sullivan. A woman's voice. Military cadence, no question mark despite the inflection. You need to listen to me very carefully. Your security clearance just triggered an automated flag in the federal database. Don't ask me how that happened. Don't ask me why. You need to be at St. Michael's Hospital Administrative Conference Room at 10:19 a.m. sharp. Can you confirm? I'm suspended, Brooke said. Not anymore, the woman said. You're reactivated. Is that a problem, Captain? The line went dead. Brooke sat in the silence of her apartment and understood, without quite knowing how, that the life she'd been living for 10 years was about to collide with the life she'd left behind at the speed of a helicopter rotor. She showered. She put on clean scrubs, not because she was allowed to wear them but because she needed something to hold on to. The jacket with the patch went on over everything. For the first time in a decade, she didn't hide it. She let it be visible, a faded ghost of identification that nobody would recognize unless they knew exactly what they were looking at. The emergency board hearing convened in the administrative conference room at 10:13 a.m. 8 board members sat at a polished oak table that cost more than Brooke had made in 3 years. Dr. Pierce sat to their left with a presentation prepared, a carefully constructed narrative about falsified credentials, dangerous overreach, insubordination, 20 witnesses to her breaking protocol. Brooke sat alone at a table across from them. The herding of prey into a pen. Then the door opened. Boots on tile. Synchronized. Sharp. The sound of military discipline entering a civilian room and instantly making everything else feel like an afterthought. A Marine colonel in dress blues entered first. His uniform was pressed so precisely that light bent off the creases. Behind him was a 2-star general. Behind him was a Navy captain in full dress whites carrying a black shadow box that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. Admiral Kieni was wheeled in last, still on oxygen, the tube beneath his nose, but his eyes were alert and his color was good and his hand reached toward Brooke the moment he was close enough. He gripped her hand. His voice was rough from the intubation, from the trauma tube, from everything his body had been through. He whispered 2 words that made Dr. Pierce stand so fast his chair fell backward. Nightingale 6. The Marine colonel opened a folder. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights hum. It was the kind of silence that comes before something shatters. Captain Brooke Sullivan, the colonel read. His voice had the weight of official record, of history being corrected. Navy Nurse Corps. Attached to Marine Special Operations Command. Baghdad, 2012 through 2014. Dr. Pierce opened his mouth. We're discussing her falsified. The 2-star general stepped forward. He was older, grey-tempered, the kind of officer who had seen things that changed the way a person looked at the world. He saluted. Not a casual gesture. A full, respectful salute of the kind given to commissioned officers who had earned their rank in blood. The Navy captain opened the shadow box. 2 medals gleamed against black velvet. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor device. The kind of decoration you receive for doing things that officially never happened. Silver Star for conspicuous gallantry, the general said. His voice carried the weight of command that made everyone in the room sit a little straighter. Bronze Star with Valor for heroic achievement under enemy fire. Operation Nightingale, classified level 6. Captain Sullivan was ordered to disappear after her operation was buried. She has been living as a ghost for a decade to protect intelligence assets and personnel still in the field. Dr. Pierce's face had gone from bone white to a sickly grey. His mouth moved without producing sound. Her credentials are not falsified, the general continued. They are precisely as we needed them to be. As we instructed them to be. She is exactly who she says she is. More than that, she is exactly who we need her to be. Admiral Kieni squeezed Brooks' hand one more time. She didn't squeeze back. She was still processing the fact that her jacket, the one with the patch, had suddenly become official. That the life she'd been hiding had just been declassified in a hospital conference room in Denver, Colorado. That she wasn't disappearing anymore. That she was, against all odds and all probability, coming back. 2 days later, the system flagged her. St. Michael's Hospital ran routine background refreshes on all credentialed staff, standard protocol, automated, invisible, and Brooks Sullivan's name triggered something the algorithm hadn't seen in 7 years. A classified security clearance. Active. Still valid. The computer sent notifications up chains of command she'd hoped never to see again, cables that ran from Denver to the Pentagon, from the Pentagon to JSOC, from JSOC to people who knew her call sign and the things she'd done in the darkness of Baghdad that would never appear in any official record. The emergency board hearing was convened for 6 p.m. No warning. No courtesy call. Just a message on her badge swipe access, report to Administrative Conference Room B, Level 3. Attendance mandatory. Brooke walked into a room she'd never seen before and found it was already full of uniforms. A Marine colonel in dress blue stood by the window. A 2-star general sat at the center of the conference table. Navy captain. 3 investigators in dark suits, FBI jackets draped over their chairs. And Admiral Kieni, conscious now, dressed in a visitor's medical gown, gripping the arm of his chair like he might fall out of it if he let go. The board chair, some administrator she recognized vaguely from hospital emails, looked more confused than she'd ever seen a human being look. His hands were shaking. Captain Sullivan, the general said. Not a greeting. A verification. Brooks' jaw clenched. Just barely. The only tell. Sir, she answered. Straightening without moving. Voice dropping an octave. Admiral. Admiral Kieni stood. Took 3 careful steps toward her, for still in his arm, and gripped her hand like an anchor. Nightingale 6, he whispered. Only her. You remembered. Only she knew what that call sign meant. Baghdad, 2015. A rooftop under fire. The hiss of a tourniquet being cinched 3 seconds before the roof's edge collapsed. The thing she'd done to keep him breathing. The Marine colonel opened a leather folder. His voice was careful, formal, the kind of precision that made the room's air pressure change. Captain Brooks Sullivan, Navy Nurse Corps, serial number 8436922N, you are hereby cited for extraordinary heroism under fire while attached to MARSOC, Baghdad sector, operation spanning 17 months, 2014 to 2015. Dr. Pierce, standing against the far wall, went white. Actually white. The color drained from his face like someone had opened a drain valve in his chest. The general stood. Saluted. Held it. A Pentagon courier stepped forward with a shadow box. Silver star. Bronze star with Valor. 2 purple hearts. The medals Brooke had surrendered to federal custody 7 years ago when she'd been ordered to disappear, when the extraction had been so classified that even her family couldn't know she'd been in country, when she'd come back to civilian life with nothing but her heartbeat and a unit patch sewn into a jacket lining. The courier's hands were steady as surgical steel. He placed the shadow box on the conference table and spoke a single word, reactivated. The board chair's confusion turned to something else. Something like fury. Dr. Pierce, perhaps you'd like to explain to this board why you attempted to restrict this patient's care. Pierce's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. Nothing came out. That was when Marcus Chen walked in. The hospital IT director. A Navy veteran running routine security checks on the hospital's network 2 nights ago, just routine maintenance, had noticed something strange. A surge in deleted files. 72 hours of surveillance footage, gone. Scrubbed from the system, burned from backups, erased with precision. Professional precision. Marcus had saved every frame. He opened a laptop. The board chair leaned in. The general leaned in. The images played on the monitor like confession footage, Dr. Pierce in the medication room at 3 a.m., altering records. Dr. Pierce in his office, opening an envelope from a pharmaceutical representative, cash sliding across his desk. Dr. Pierce in the billing department, submitting claims to the VA for phantom consultations on military patients, a pattern stretching back 23 months, $847,000 in fraudulent charges, his pocket deeper every week. Federal investigators didn't need to be invited twice. They stood, moved toward Pierce like water finding its level, inevitable and absolute. Dr. Harold Pierce, you're being placed under investigation for federal fraud, falsification of medical records, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and obstruction of justice, the lead investigator said. You have the right to remain silent. Pierce reached for his phone. Made a call. Then another. Then a third. Nobody answered. The board members who owed him favors suddenly had no memory of owing him anything. The politicians on his speed dial weren't available. The network that had held him up for 2 decades had decided, simultaneously and without consultation, that he was too much liability. Security escorted him from the building 42 minutes later. Not the guards he'd threatened Brooke with. Different ones. Younger ones. Professional ones. His BMW stayed in the parking lot. His access badge went into an evidence bag. The general returned Brooke's medals. Held them out, palms open, like an offering. You're reactivated, Captain. If you want to be. Brooke took the shadow box. Felt the weight of it. 7 years of gravity in her hands. I just want to take care of patients, sir, she said. I just want to help people. The general nodded. Then do it here. As yourself this time. Admiral Kieni pulled her into an embrace that lasted longer than protocol allowed. You saved me twice, he whispered into her shoulder. Baghdad. And here. The room went so quiet you could hear the fluorescent lights humming. 6 months later, Brooke passed a community college classroom on the north side of Denver. Through the window, she saw a man in casual clothes standing in front of a plastic CPR dummy, demonstrating chest compressions to a classroom of future EMT students. His voice carried the flat monotone of someone reading from a script he didn't believe anymore. His watch was gone. His tie was synthetic. His shoes were wearing through at the heel. Dr. Pierce didn't look up when she walked past. He already knew she was there. She entered her office on the 3rd floor of St. Michael's and stood for a moment in the doorway, just breathing. Director of Veteran Services. The first program of its kind in Denver. A position that had been created specifically for her, by a hospital board that had finally understood what they'd been looking at all along. The faded 2nd Medical Battalion patch hung on her wall now. Not hidden inside a jacket lining. Not sewn secretly into seams. Framed. Visible. Openly displayed alongside her silver star, her bronze star, photographs of her MARSOC team in Baghdad, the faces of people she'd bled with and carried and saved. Admiral Kieni visited every month for follow-up appointments. He always brought coffee. Always stayed to talk. The other veterans started coming, drawn by word of mouth, by the kind of gravitational pull that comes from someone who actually understands, who carries the weight without pretending it's light. The 20 doctors who had walked away that day each received formal reprimands in their files. 3 lost hospital privileges. 2 resigned rather than face the board's questions. Marcus Chen from IT became the unofficial security liaison for the program, stopping by to check the camera systems and staying for hours to swap deployment stories. Brooke taught combat medicine to residents now. 1 day a month, she wore her dress uniform, captain's insignia on the shoulder, medals on the chest, the unit patch openly displayed, and stood in front of doctors who listened with respect instead of mockery. They asked questions. She answered them. Her voice carried authority now, the kind that couldn't be questioned because everyone in the room knew exactly what it was built on. Her coffee was hot when she poured it. Her reflection was clear when she looked in the mirror. She was visible again. The jacket hanging on her office door bore the patch on the shoulder now, where it belonged, where it had always belonged, and when she looked at it in the afternoon light, she could see the whole of herself finally. Not the nurse pretending to be invisible. Not the soldier pretending to be civilian. Just Brooke. Just Captain Brooke Sullivan, Navy Nurse Corps, the woman who'd held lives together with her bare hands in Baghdad and held them together again in Denver, the woman who'd walked through humiliation and survived it, who'd been invisible and chosen to be visible again. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated and proven them wrong, subscribe to Code Whisperers. Like this video. Share it with someone who needs to know they matter. And comment below, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns.